My name is Elias Thorne. I'm 82 years old, and I've spent almost my entire life in Salem, Massachusetts. I'm a retired architect, though I still look at every facade and roofline as if I'm studying an unfinished project. I lost my wife, Eleanor, 10 years ago, and since then, my routines have been my anchor. Black coffee at 6 a.m. on the porch, reading the local paper, and late afternoon walks through the historic streets of town. I always pass slowly by the old Victorian houses, noticing details only someone who's spent a lifetime designing them would see. My house, it wasn't just a house. It was a living piece of my history with Eleanor, a light-colored Victorian, lovingly restored by our own hands over decades. Every room carried a trace of her, the scent of cinnamon in the kitchen, the hand-stitched curtain in the bedroom, the specific creak in the hallway floor that she used to call our secret signal of arrival. To me, the place was like a life-sized photo album. In recent years, my contact with my son David had been sporadic. He lived in Boston with his wife and my 2 grandchildren. I clung to each visit, no matter how brief, always imagining that in time they'd spend more weekends here. The sound of children's footsteps running down the hallway could bring the whole house to life. That's what it was built for. To be full, to echo with voices, to shelter stories. That day, just a regular Tuesday, I was sitting in my living room chair, watching the late afternoon light spill through the stained glass window, scattering colors across the rug. The phone rang. It was David. I thought he was calling to make plans for Thanksgiving, but the conversation took a turn I never expected, not even in my worst moments of doubt. After a few minutes of small talk, he said the sentence that still echoes in my mind. "Dad, we've been thinking. It's probably time for you to move into a home. We just don't have the space for you here." His voice was calm, almost rehearsed, like someone trying to avoid a fight. I felt as though the ground had dropped out from under me. Me, the man who had built homes for countless families, was being told there was no room for me in my own. I didn't answer right away. My eyes wandered. The bookshelf full of Eleanor's favorite novels, the dining table where we'd celebrated 25 Christmases, the fireplace that had warmed so many conversations. Each object seemed to stare back at me, silently witnessing the humiliation. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, and yet my voice came out steady. I agreed with him, though not in the way he imagined. When I hung up, there were no tears, no outburst. What came instead was a cold, cutting clarity. I knew exactly what I was going to do. That very week, I started calling real estate agents. No one knew, not neighbors, not friends. It was my decision alone. If my son thought I was a burden, I'd lift that burden from his hands in a way he'd never forget. Each agent visit was done quietly. I opened the doors, walked them through each room as if there was no emotional weight tied to them. But inside it felt like I was peeling away layers of my soul. The scent of polished wood, the ring left by a glass on the dining table, the cabinet where Eleanor kept the good dishes. All of it seemed to whisper that I was betraying my own memories. And yet somehow that feeling gave me strength. For the first time in years, I was in control. The first. Potential buyers came on a rainy Thursday. I remember the smell of wet leaves drifting in through the front door as I showed them around. They were a young couple, probably in their early 30s, with the kind of wide-eyed enthusiasm I once had when Eleanor and I first walked into this house. I kept my explanations factual: square footage, year built, the type of wood used for the staircase banister. But every fact carried a memory I didn't share. They saw a house. I saw a lifetime, compressed into walls and floorboards. That night, after they left, I walked through each room alone. I ran my fingers along the grooves in the kitchen table, marks left by years of family dinners and Eleanor's habit of using a knife without a cutting board. In the living room, I sat in my usual chair, listening to the rain tapping on the windows. I thought about what David had said. "We don't have the space for you here." Space. That was the word that had pushed me over the edge. This house had held generations, and now there wasn't space for one old man. Over the next 2 weeks, the process moved quickly. My agent, a sharp woman named Linda with a no-nonsense tone, told me there was strong interest from several buyers. I let her handle everything, signing documents without hesitation. The more I committed, the lighter I felt. It wasn't joy. It was something colder, like detachment. I was dismantling the life David assumed would always be there for him, piece by piece. One afternoon, while sorting through Eleanor's belongings, I found a shoebox tucked in the back of her closet. Inside were handwritten letters, some addressed to me, others to David when he was a boy. I read one, just one, before closing the box again. It wasn't time to drown in nostalgia. Those letters would go with me wherever I ended up. The rest of the house could belong to someone else. The hardest part came when I packed away the photographs. Framed moments that once hung proudly in the hallway now lay in cardboard boxes. Our wedding day in 1961, David's first steps in the backyard, Eleanor's laugh frozen in a grainy snapshot from a summer picnic. I wrapped each one in newspaper, thinking about how the next occupants might paint over the walls that had held them. By the end of the month, the sale was nearly finalized. Linda called to confirm the closing date, and I agreed without hesitation. The papers would be signed 2 days before Thanksgiving. I didn't tell David. He still believed I'd be in this house waiting for his call, ready to bring a pie to their holiday table. The thought almost made me smile. Almost. The day before the closing, I walked through the neighborhood at dusk. Salem's old streets were quiet, the lamplight catching on the wet cobblestones. I noticed every detail, the chipped paint on a neighbor's fence, the faint smell of chimney smoke, as if I were memorizing them for the last time. When I reached my porch, I stood there for a long while, imagining what Eleanor would say if she were beside me. I hoped she'd understand. That night I wrote the letter to David. It was short, just 3 sentences, that I had sold the house, that I wouldn't be joining them for Thanksgiving, and that I was leaving him a key to a lockbox. I didn't explain what was in it or where I was going. I simply signed my name. When I sealed the envelope, I felt something shift inside me. Not relief, not regret, but a kind of finality I'd never felt before. The morning of the closing, I woke earlier than usual. The house felt different, almost hollow, as though it already knew it no longer belonged to me. My footsteps echoed in a way they never had before, the absence of furniture and familiar clutter making every sound sharper. I brewed one last pot of coffee in the kitchen, leaning against the counter where Eleanor used to stand, with her hair still damp from the morning shower, humming without realizing it. I didn't drink it right away. Instead, I held the mug in my hands and let the steam rise into my face, breathing in the quiet. There was no rush. The next time I left through that front door, I would be walking away for good. I took my time getting dressed, pulling on a pressed shirt and my old tweed jacket. The one Eleanor always said made me look like a professor with secrets. I walked from room to room, running my hand along the walls, feeling the grooves of the woodwork I had restored myself decades ago. In the dining room, I paused by the window where we had watched countless snowfalls together, our hands wrapped around mugs of cocoa. The thought hit me that the new owners might replace these windows, tear out the stained glass, erase the history without even knowing they were doing it. That was the hardest part, not the loss itself, but the inevitability that they wouldn't understand what they had taken. At the real estate office, the transaction was quick, almost brutally so. Papers were slid across the table, signatures applied, hands shaken. Linda congratulated me, her smile professional, though I could tell she sensed the weight of what had just happened. The young couple buying the house was there too, beaming with the excitement of a new chapter. I managed to return their smiles, but inside I was thinking how strange it was that life could transfer so neatly from one set of hands to another with nothing more than ink and paper. When I walked out of the office, the November air felt colder, sharper than it had that morning. I pulled my coat tighter and drove straight to the post office. The letter to David was in the inside pocket of my jacket, the key taped to the folded page. It felt heavier than it should have, like it contained not just metal and words, but the final measure of our relationship. I handed it to the clerk to be sent as certified mail, knowing it would arrive in his hands on Thanksgiving morning. That was deliberate. I wanted him to open it with the smell of turkey in the air, with the sound of laughter in the background, and feel the silence that followed. Back at the house, I packed the last of my things into 2 suitcases. I was careful not to overfill them. There was no room for excess where I was going. I had booked a small apartment on the other side of town, a place no one in my family had ever visited, tucked above a bakery that smelled like warm bread at dawn. It wasn't grand, but it would be mine. And more importantly, it would be out of David's reach. I didn't want him knocking on my door to negotiate, to smooth things over with the same detached tone he'd used on the phone. This was a clean break. Before locking up, I stood in the foyer for a long time. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the stained glass, painting the floor in patches of amber, red, and green. I tried to memorize the way the colors shifted as the light moved, the faint creak of the floorboards under my feet, the way the air smelled faintly of lemon polish even, though I hadn't used it in weeks. I thought of Eleanor again, how she used to say the house breathed differently in the fall. I whispered goodbye, not to the structure, but to her. When I stepped outside, the street was empty. I locked the door, slipped the key into the envelope I'd leave for the new owners, and placed it in the mailbox, mounted by the door. My suitcases waited by the porch steps, looking smaller than I expected, almost modest compared to the enormity of what they represented. I took one last look at the house. It wasn't the building I was leaving behind. It was the version of myself that had lived there. I carried my bags to the waiting cab. As it pulled away, I didn't turn back. I'd already said my goodbye, and there was nothing left for me in those walls. The ride was silent except for the hum of the tires on the road. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about preserving anything. Not a home, not a tradition, not a fragile peace with my son. I was thinking about the open stretch of life ahead, unplanned and unclaimed. It was terrifying, but in that moment, it also felt like freedom. The apartment above the bakery was smaller than any place I had lived since my college days, but it was warm, and the constant aroma of bread in the mornings gave it a kind of quiet comfort. The landlord, a man named Joseph with wiry grey hair and a Boston accent so thick it could cut glass, handed me the keys without ceremony. "It's yours for as long as you want it, Mr. Thorne," he said, and I appreciated the lack of questions. I didn't want to explain why a man my age was moving into a walk-up with creaky stairs and no elevator. I settled in slowly, arranging my belongings with care, though not the same care I'd given the Victorian. This place wasn't a museum of my past. It was a blank page. In the first few days, I found myself walking the neighborhood just to get my bearings. There was a small park a few blocks away, a modest grocery store, and a coffee shop run by a young woman who insisted on calling me sir, no matter how many times I told her to use my first name. People didn't know me here. They didn't know Eleanor. They didn't know my house. They didn't know David. I realized how liberating that was, to exist without the shadow of someone else's expectations. Still, at night, the silence was thick, and I would catch myself listening for the familiar creaks and sighs of the home I had left behind. I avoided calling David. Part of me wondered if he had received the letter yet, but I wasn't eager for the fallout. I knew exactly how he would react. Not with open anger, but with that clipped, dismissive tone he used when something didn't go his way. He would likely frame my decision as irrational, a sign of age catching up to me rather than what it truly was. A deliberate act of reclaiming control. I had no interest in defending myself to him. On the morning of Thanksgiving, I woke early, as always. The bakery downstairs was already busy. the faint sound of clinking trays and the rush of ovens filling the air. I made my own coffee, sat by the small kitchen window, and watched the street come alive with families carrying covered dishes, children bundled in scarves, cars loaded with food and gifts. In years past, I would have been at the old house by this hour, preparing to drive to David's, pie carefully wrapped in the back seat. Now, there was no pie, no drive, no obligation. It felt strange, a little hollow, but also undeniably lighter. By late morning, I imagined the letter had reached him. I pictured the scene in my head with surprising clarity, the mail arriving as his wife basted the turkey, his children running through the living room, and him tearing open the certified envelope with mild irritation. I imagined his eyes narrowing as he read the 3 short sentences, the confusion flickering into something colder, then the weight of the small taped key pressing into his palm. He wouldn't know what it opened, and that was the point. Some parts of me, some memories, were now locked away from him entirely. I didn't hear from him that day, which didn't surprise me. Instead, I took a long walk through the park, the air crisp and sharp, the leaves brittle under my shoes. I passed a group of teenagers tossing a football and an older couple feeding ducks at the pond. No one knew that my life had quietly shifted on its axis, that this day was the first of a new chapter I had chosen. Even if it had been forced by disappointment, I liked that anonymity. That night I cooked myself a simple meal, roasted vegetables, a small cut of turkey, and a glass of the wine Eleanor and I used to drink on special occasions. I ate slowly, taking my time with each bite, not because the food was particularly good, but because I wanted to mark the moment. This was my Thanksgiving, stripped of obligation, stripped of pretense, but still mine. I raised my glass to the empty chair across from me and whispered, "We did the right thing, Elle." As I went to bed, I wondered how long David would let the silence stretch before reaching out. I suspected it might be weeks, maybe longer. I also wondered if, when he did call, there would be any real conversation left between us, or if we'd simply exchange polite words, like strangers who once shared an address. The thought didn't frighten me as much as it once would have. Somewhere deep down, I already knew that the thread between us had frayed long before the house was sold. It was 3 days after Thanksgiving when the call finally came. I was sitting at the small table in my apartment, halfway through the crossword in the Salem Gazette, when my phone lit up with David's name. For a moment, I just stared at it, letting it ring twice before I answered. His voice was tight, controlled, the kind of tone he used in business meetings. "Dad, I got your letter." No greeting, no pause. I could hear background noise, clinking dishes, maybe the hum of his dishwasher, and I pictured him pacing his kitchen, trying to decide how much of his frustration to let slip through. "I figured you did," I said, keeping my tone even. There was a long silence on his end, long enough that I almost thought the call had dropped. Then he spoke again, quieter this time. "You sold the house without telling me?" It was the kind of question that wasn't really a question, more like an accusation wrapped in disbelief. I could almost see his eyebrows drawn. Together, that incredulous look he'd had since he was a teenager, whenever something didn't fit his version of the world. "Yes," I replied simply. I didn't owe him a performance, didn't owe him an explanation beyond that. But I could feel his anger swelling through the line, so I added, "It was my decision to make, David. My house, my life." There was a sharp exhale on his end, the sound of someone biting back words. For a moment, I thought he might hang up. Instead, he tried a different tactic. "You could have at least talked to me. We could have figured something out." That made me laugh, not loudly, but the kind of laugh that comes when you hear something absurd. "You already figured something out," I said. "You decided I should move into a home because you didn't have space for me. You made your position clear." The silence that followed was heavier than the one before. I imagined him realizing that every word I'd just said was true, and there was no way to dress it up as kindness. He finally said, "It wasn't meant like that." I leaned back in my chair, looking out the window at the street below, where a young man was locking up his bike. "Intent doesn't change the impact," I told him. "You may not have meant to push me out, but you did. And now I've taken the step you seemed to want." There was a rustle on his end. Maybe him shifting uncomfortably, maybe pacing. I didn't think you'd actually leave," he admitted, his voice softer now. That sentence told me more than he realized. He had assumed I would cling to the house, to him, no matter what, that I would accept whatever scraps of time and attention he offered. And maybe, until that phone call in November, he would have been right. "You didn't think I'd leave because you don't know me anymore," I said. "Maybe you never really did." The words came out steady, but inside I felt the dull ache of truth. Relationships don't shatter in one moment. They erode slowly, like stone underwater, until one day you look down and realize there's nothing left to stand on. We spoke for another few minutes, but the conversation had already reached its end. He asked where I was living now, and I told him I was fine, that I had everything I needed. He didn't press for details, and I didn't offer them. When we hung up, I felt the strange mix of relief and finality that comes when you realize a chapter of your life is truly closed. I sat there for a while, listening to the faint hum of the bakery downstairs, and thought about how quiet the house must feel without me in it, and how, for the first time, that thought didn't hurt. The days after our conversation slipped into a new rhythm, one I hadn't experienced in years. Mornings were filled with the smell of fresh bread from the bakery below, a soundscape of early risers chatting over coffee before heading to work. I would take my own mug down to the park, sit on a bench, and watch the slow procession of life. Joggers with determined faces, mothers pushing strollers, the occasional old man walking his dog with more patience than speed. There was something grounding in being surrounded by strangers, people who didn't know my history, who weren't looking at me through the lens of who I used to be or what I had lost. I started to notice small things about my new neighborhood. The way the afternoon light fell in stripes across the brick walls, the uneven rhythm of the crosswalk signal outside the corner store, the distinct clink of the bakery's doorbell when someone walked in. I'd never realized how much space in my old life had been filled with the weight of expectation. Here, the days felt lighter, even if they were quieter. That quiet was still strange to me at night, though. Sometimes I'd wake at 2 in the morning, instinctively listening for the familiar creaks of the Victorians' floorboards, and feel the absence like a missing tooth. About a week later, David called again. His tone was softer this time, more hesitant. He asked how I was settling in, whether I needed anything. I told him I had everything I needed and thanked him for asking. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but there was a different undercurrent, less confrontation, more searching. I suspected he was still trying to reconcile my decision with the version of me he had carried in his mind all these years. The father who stayed put, the man who kept the family home intact no matter what. Around the same time, I began sorting through the few boxes I'd brought from the house. Inside one, I found Eleanor's letters again, the ones I'd discovered in her closet before the move. That evening, I sat at my small kitchen table and read through half a dozen of them. Some were mundane, notes she'd left for me while I was away on work trips. Others were tender, filled with the kind of small observations only someone who truly knew you could make. They reminded me that my life, even now, wasn't just defined by what I had lost. It was also shaped by the choices I still had the power to make. A few days later, I saw David's number appear on my phone again, but I let it go to voicemail. He left a message saying he'd like to come visit sometime soon. Though he didn't sound entirely sure whether he wanted me to take him up on it, I didn't call back right away. I wanted time, not just to decide whether I was ready to see him, but to make sure that if he did come, it would be on terms I could live with. I Wasn't going to invite him into this new space, only to have him treat it like a temporary stop before pushing me back toward the life he thought I should have. Meanwhile, I kept exploring Salem. I visited the library, where the librarian, a sharp-eyed woman named Carol, insisted I join the Thursday book club. I declined politely, but I found myself lingering in the aisles, thumbing through architectural history books and running my fingers along the spines like I was tracing old friends. It was in moments like these that I felt something stirring again. Not joy exactly, but a kind of steady contentment I hadn't known in years. Still, there was an undercurrent of unfinished business between me and David. Every call, every message, every imagined visit felt like a thread we hadn't decided whether to pull or cut entirely. I could feel the tension building towards something. Not necessarily a reconciliation, but a reckoning. Part of me dreaded it. Another part wanted it over with, like tearing off a bandage. One evening, as I stood at my window watching the streetlights flicker on, I realized that for the first time in a long while, I wasn't living in reaction to someone else's choices. Whatever came next with David, I had reclaimed my ability to decide the terms of my own life. And that, even more than the sale of the house, was the real act of taking my power back. It was a Saturday morning when David finally followed through on his promise to visit. He called the night before, his voice careful, almost rehearsed, asking if I'd be home around 10. I told him yes, but didn't offer coffee or breakfast. I wanted him to arrive without the cushioning of small talk or rituals from the past. When the knock came, it was firm but hesitant. I opened the door to find him standing there in a tailored coat, looking both out of place and slightly uncomfortable in the narrow hallway. His eyes scanned the apartment behind me like he was trying to fit me into this smaller, simpler space, and failing. We exchanged a brief hug, the kind you give a relative you haven't seen in years, but aren't entirely sure you're glad to see. I stepped aside, and he walked in slowly, his gaze taking in the modest furniture, the small kitchen table, the faint smell of bread drifting up from downstairs. "It's different," he said finally, the words hanging between us like dust motes in sunlight. I could tell he was holding back questions. Why here? Why so small? Why so far from what I had built before, but he didn't voice them. I gestured for him to sit, and we took our places at the table. I poured us both coffee, black for me, cream for him, just as I had when he visited the old house. For a moment, there was a strange echo of familiarity, but it dissolved when he asked, "Do you regret selling it?" I looked at him over the rim of my mug, letting the question breathe before I answered. "No," I said, "not for a second." His jaw tightened, and he nodded slowly, but I could see the flicker of something in his eyes. Disbelief, maybe even a little hurt. He tried again, leaning back in his chair. "It's just, that house was part of the family. It was where I grew up." I let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. "It was where you grew up, yes, but in the end, you were the one who told me there was no space for me in your life anymore. You may not have meant it like that, but that's how it landed, and once I heard it, I couldn't unhear it." His gaze dropped to the table, and for the first time that morning, I saw a crack in his practiced composure. The silence between us was heavier than the walls. I thought about softening my words, but decided against it. I had spent too many years cushioning the truth to keep the peace. Instead, I asked, "Do you even know what that house meant to me, to your mother?" His head lifted slightly and he shook it. "I guess I thought it would always just be there," he admitted, "like part of the landscape." That told me everything. He had seen it as permanent, unshakable, something he could take for granted. We sat in that truth for a while, sipping coffee in the small kitchen of my new life. Eventually, he said, "I'm sorry, Dad." The words were quiet, almost unsure of themselves, but they landed in the air between us with a weight I hadn't expected. I nodded once, acknowledging them, but I didn't rush to absolve him. Apologies are just seeds. They need time and action before they grow into anything meaningful. Before he left, David walked to the window and looked out over the street. "It's nice here," he said, and I could hear in his voice that he didn't quite believe it, but he was trying. I appreciated the effort, even if it felt thin. As he turned back toward the door, I said, "You're welcome to visit, but understand, this is my space. I'm not looking for approval. I'm looking for peace." He nodded again, more firmly this time, and I could see that he understood at least that much. When the door closed behind him, the apartment felt quieter but not empty. I stood there for a moment listening to the fading sound of his footsteps on the stairs. For the first time since the sale, I felt certain I had done the right thing. Not to punish him, but to reclaim the life I had almost let slip away. In the weeks after David's visit, I noticed a subtle shift in the rhythm of my days. He began calling more often, sometimes without a clear reason, just to check in. The conversations were still brief, but there was less tension in his voice, less of that clipped efficiency that used to make me feel like a business meeting slotted between more important tasks. He asked about the bakery downstairs, about the park I mentioned walking through, about the view from my kitchen window. These were small things, but they were questions rooted in curiosity rather than obligation, and that difference mattered. I didn't mistake these calls for a full repair of what had been broken. Trust, once cracked, doesn't snap back into place just because the silence has been filled. But I found myself answering when I could, and when I couldn't, I returned his calls eventually, on my own time. That was new for me. In the past, I'd picked up on the first ring, afraid that missing a call might push him further away. Now, I realized that the relationship we had was already on my terms. The weight of always accommodating him had lifted, and in its place was something steadier, even if it was smaller. During this time, I was also building a life that had nothing to do with him. I started going to the library's Thursday book club, despite my earlier reluctance. Carol, the librarian, turned out to be sharp-tongued and warm in equal measure, and the other members, a mix of retirees, grad students, and one opinionated middle school teacher, gave me a sense of belonging I hadn't realized I'd missed. They didn't know me as David's father or Eleanor's husband. They knew me as Elias, the man who always had an opinion on 19th century design and never missed a meeting. I also began sketching again. At first, it was just quick outlines in a notebook, little studies of buildings I passed on my walks. But soon, I was spending hours at the small desk by my window, filling page after page with imagined houses, not grand Victorians, but smaller spaces, designed for one or two people, built for light and quiet. It struck me that these designs mirrored my own life now, stripped down, functional and intentional, without unnecessary rooms for people who had no desire to stay. David noticed the change in me before I fully did. One evening during a call, he said, "You sound different, happier, maybe." I didn't confirm it out loud, but I knew he was right. Happiness wasn't exactly the word. It was more like contentment, the kind that comes from choosing your own walls to live within. I realized with some surprise that I no longer measured my days by whether or not I heard from him. He was part of my life, but not the axis it spun on. That winter, Salem had its first heavy snow, and I found myself walking to the park just to watch it blanket the old statues and lampposts. The air was sharp in my lungs, and my boots crunched over the powder in a rhythm that felt almost meditative. I thought about how, just a year earlier, I would have been inside the old house, worrying about whether the roof could handle the weight, whether the heat was running evenly through the upstairs rooms. Now, the snow wasn't a problem to solve. It was simply there, and I could enjoy it without the weight of responsibility dragging behind it. By February, David suggested we meet for lunch in Boston. It wasn't framed as a holiday obligation or a family duty, just a lunch. We sat in a small Italian restaurant near his office, the kind of place where the waiters know your name. Conversation flowed more easily than it had in years, drifting from stories about my neighborhood to anecdotes about his kids. There were still careful pauses, still things left unsaid, but it felt less like a negotiation and more like an exchange between two adults who were slowly learning each other again. When I returned home from that lunch, I sat in my armchair by the window, the street below buzzing with late afternoon traffic. I realized that my decision to sell the house had set something in motion that I hadn't expected. Not reconciliation exactly, but the creation of a boundary David now seemed to respect. And with that boundary in place, there was room for something new to grow, even if it was fragile. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I felt like I was standing on my own ground. By the time spring settled over Salem, the streets had shaken off their winter quiet. The park benches no longer sat empty. The bakery downstairs kept its door propped open to let the smell of fresh loaves drift into the street. And I found myself walking further each day, past familiar blocks into neighborhoods I'd never really explored. It was on one of those walks that I stopped in front of a modest two-story home with pale green shutters and a wraparound porch. It wasn't remarkable in size or design, but something about it made me pause. It had a certain balance, the kind of house built for comfort rather than show. I pulled out my sketchbook and began to draw it, realizing halfway through that this simple act, standing there pencil moving unhurried, was something I hadn't allowed myself in years. David called later that week, his tone lighter than usual. "I have something for you," he said, and when I asked what it was, he only replied, "You'll see. Can I come by Saturday?" My instinct was to guard my space, to keep our meetings on neutral ground, but there was a sincerity in his voice I hadn't heard in a long time, so I told him to come. The morning he arrived, the apartment was filled with the smell of bread and the sound of street musicians playing a block away. He walked in carrying a long, flat package wrapped in brown paper, setting it gently on the table before taking off his coat. "Go ahead," he said, gesturing to the package. I unwrapped it slowly, careful not to tear the paper, and found myself looking at a framed photograph. The Victorian house, my Victorian house, taken from the exact angle Eleanor had loved to stand when she looked back at it from the street. The photo had been printed in black and white, giving it a timeless quality, and beneath it was a small brass plaque engraved with the words, "For the man who built more than a home." I ran my fingers over the frame, not trusting myself to speak right away. "It's not the same as keeping it," David said after a moment, "but I thought maybe you'd like to have it here." There was a tentative edge to his voice, like he was testing the weight of each word. I set the frame down and looked at him, searching for the angle, the hidden motive. But for once, there wasn't one. It was just a gesture, unadorned and without strings. I thanked him quietly, and when he asked if he could hang it for me, I nodded. We decided on the wall across from the table, where I could see it every morning with my coffee. As he hammered the small nail into the plaster, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. The house was gone, but here it was, distilled into an image I could keep without the burden of its upkeep or the weight of its history pressing down on me. When he stepped back to admire the placement, I realized that this was the first time in a long while that he'd done something for me without it being tied to his own convenience or expectations. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a start. We spent the rest of the afternoon walking through my neighborhood. I showed him the park where I sat most mornings, the bookstore that sold used architectural journals for $1, and the bench outside the bakery where I liked to drink my coffee on sunny days. He seemed genuinely interested, asking questions about people I'd met and places I'd found. There was a lightness to our conversation, a lack of tension I hadn't thought possible a few months ago. It struck me that maybe he needed to see me here in this pared-down version of my life to understand that I hadn't just moved. I had chosen something different. That evening, after he left, I sat at the table looking at the photograph. The house In the picture no longer belonged to me, but the story it told still did. It wasn't just about wood and stone. It was about the years I'd lived inside it, the people I'd loved there, and the choice I'd made to walk away when staying meant losing myself. The frame was a reminder, not of what I'd lost, but of what I'd taken back. The next day, I caught myself rearranging the sketch I'd been working on of the green shuttered house. Without really thinking about it, I added details that mirrored the balance I felt returning to my life. Windows that let in light, a porch that invited people to sit, a solid foundation with no cracks to hide. I realized that the act of building, even on paper, was my way of marking time, of measuring where I'd been and where I still wanted to go. By the end of that week, I hung the sketch next to the photograph. 2 houses side by side, one from the past, one from my imagination. One representing everything I had built and released, the other, everything I still could. It felt like the right place to stand between them. Over the following month, I found myself leaning more into the routines that belonged entirely to me. Mornings were for coffee at the bakery or on the park bench if the weather allowed, afternoons for sketching or wandering Salem's quieter streets. Sometimes I'd stop in small shops I'd passed dozens of times but never entered, just to see what was inside. One, a cramped little antique store run by a man named Paul, became a favorite. He had a habit of telling elaborate stories about each item, whether they were true or not, and I enjoyed listening, letting the hours stretch without the sense that I had somewhere else to be. That absence of urgency, of someone else's timeline, was something I hadn't realized I'd been missing for years. David's calls kept coming, though now they were different. He asked about the sketchbook, about whether I'd added new drawings, even about the people I mentioned from book club. There was a hesitancy to his questions, as if he was learning to step carefully, to respect the boundaries I'd drawn without him needing to bump into them first. For the first time in decades, I felt like he was seeing me as a person rather than an extension of a role, not just dad, the safety net, the inevitable fallback. I didn't say it to him, but I noticed it, and I was careful to respond in ways that didn't encourage us to slip back into old patterns. It was Carol from the library, who convinced me to put some of my sketches on display. She insisted they deserved to be seen, and after enough persistence, I agreed to let her hang a few in the library's small community gallery. The night of the opening, a few dozen people showed up. Some I knew from around the neighborhood, others complete strangers. They lingered in front of my drawings longer than I expected, asking questions, pointing out details. For years, my work had existed only in blueprints and physical structures. Now it lived on paper, untethered to anyone else's demands. I walked home that night with a quiet sense of pride I hadn't felt since my early career. David surprised me by coming to see the exhibit the following week. He walked slowly along the display, hands in his pockets, pausing in front of the sketch of the green shuttered house for longer than the rest. "This one," he said finally, "looks peaceful." I nodded. That was the idea. He didn't press for a deeper meaning, and I appreciated. And that. Instead, he asked if I'd keep drawing. I told him I would, and for the first time in a long while, I think he believed me without needing to know why. Spring turned to early summer, and the light in Salem shifted. Days grew longer, the air warmer, and I spent more time outside, often with my sketchbook balanced on my knee. I noticed how these simple moments began to anchor me. Not the grand milestones, but the repetition of small, intentional acts. I was no longer building my days around what David might need or expect. I was building them for myself, and in that process, I could feel the distance between us change shape. Still present, but no longer a wound. One afternoon in June, David called to ask if I wanted to join them for a Sunday picnic just outside Boston. My first instinct was to decline, worried that it might pull me back into the dynamic I'd worked so hard to change. But then I realized that I could choose to go without surrendering the ground I'd gained. "I'll come," I said. but only if I can leave when I'm ready. He agreed without hesitation, and that small concession meant more to me than I think he realized. The picnic was pleasant. We sat on a blanket in the shade, his kids chasing each other across the grass, while his wife arranged plates of sandwiches and fruit. Conversation stayed light, weaving between stories from my neighborhood and updates about the children's school. There was no tension, no undercurrent of judgment, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a guest being tolerated out of obligation. I stayed for 2 hours, then stood, thanked them, and left. As I drove back to Salem, windows down and the warm air spilling in, I realized I felt no guilt for leaving early. The visit had been enough. That night, I placed the picnic invitation on the table beneath the photograph of the Victorian. Not as a memento, but as a reminder. I could choose my place in my son's life without surrendering myself to it. I wasn't the man, waiting by the phone anymore, afraid of missing my chance to be included. I was here in my own space, living a life I had shaped with my own hands, one deliberate choice at a time. By late summer, Salem was alive with the hum of tourists. The sidewalks were crowded with people taking photographs of the old houses, tracing the same streets I walked daily. Normally, I kept to the quieter routes, but one afternoon, curiosity pulled me toward the harbor. The air smelled of salt and fried food, and the sound of gulls cut through the chatter of visitors. I sat on a bench overlooking the water, sketchbook in hand, and let myself drift into the rhythm of the scene. That's when my phone buzzed, David's name lighting the screen. His voice was calm but carried a weight I hadn't heard in months. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something important. Can I come by tonight?" When he arrived that evening, he didn't bring his usual cautious smile. Instead, he looked tired, his posture slouched in a way that made him seem older. We sat at the table, the photograph of the Victorian just over his shoulder, and he told me the news. His firm was downsizing, and he'd been let go. "We're going to have to make some big changes," he said, and I could tell by the way he avoided my eyes that the next sentence would be harder. "We might need to sell the house." For a moment, I just studied him. My son, who had once told me I no longer fit into his space, now facing the loss of his own. I didn't say, "I told you so," though the thought brushed the edge of my mind. Instead, I asked, "What do you need from me?" He hesitated, then admitted, "Advice. Maybe some help finding a smaller place." There was no request for money, no hint at moving in with me, just a straightforward acknowledgement that I might have wisdom he didn't. That, in itself, felt like a quiet turning point. We talked for over an hour, weighing his options, discussing neighborhoods and budgets. I could see his pride, a waver every now and then, but he stayed with the conversation. After he left, I stood for a while at the window, watching the streetlights flicker on. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who once suggested I live in a facility was now coming to me for guidance on how to downsize with dignity. But it didn't feel like revenge. It felt balanced, like the universe had quietly folded the map so that our paths met again on even ground. I realized that part of me had been waiting for this, not for him to fall, but for him to see that change doesn't have to be a loss if you choose it yourself. Over the next few weeks, we met several times to look at listings online. Some evenings he came to the apartment with takeout, and we'd sit side by side, comparing layouts and discussing the merits of small kitchens versus open living spaces. It reminded me, in small flashes, of when he was a teenager helping me with a renovation. That same mix of focus and the occasional half-smile when he caught himself enjoying the process. We weren't repairing the past, but we were building something else, brick by brick. One Saturday, he asked if I'd come with him to see a house in person. It was a modest Cape Cod-style home on the outskirts of Boston, with a weathered shingle exterior and a yard just big enough for his kids to play in. As we walked through the rooms, I could tell he was picturing their life there. He looked at me at one point and said, It's not the Victorian, but it feels right. Nodded because I knew exactly what he meant. Sometimes the right space isn't the one with the grand history. It's the one that fits the life you have now. When he made an offer on the place a week later, he called me first to tell me it had been accepted. "Thanks, Dad," he said, and for the first time in a long time, the words didn't feel perfunctory. I told him I was proud of him, not just for finding the house, but for making the choice without letting fear dictate it. I knew Eleanor would have been proud too. That night, I took down the green shuttered house sketch from the wall and set it on the table next to the Victorian photograph. Two different stories, two different kinds of letting go. I thought about how far we'd both come since that November afternoon when he'd told me there was no space for me. Space, I realized, isn't just about square footage. It's about how you choose to make room. For yourself, for others, for change. And for the first time, I felt like we were both learning that lesson at the same time. By early autumn, the air in Salem had taken on that sharp, briny edge that signaled the approach of colder days. Leaves turned to shades of amber and rust, littering the sidewalks in crisp layers. I found myself walking more often in the late afternoons, letting the cool air clear my head. David's move into his new home had gone smoothly, and for the first time in years, I'd been invited to see one of his houses without the underlying tension of obligation. When I pulled up to the modest Cape Cod, I was struck by how right it felt for him. Manageable, warm, without the overreach of something designed more for image than for living. Inside, the space was still in that half-finished stage, with boxes stacked in corners and furniture arranged just enough to make it functional. His wife greeted me warmly, the kids darting in and out of the room with an energy I'd forgotten homes could contain. David gave me a tour, pointing out where they planned to put the dining table, the garden his wife wanted to start, the small, spare room he thought might become an office. There was no edge to his voice, no defensiveness, just the ease of someone settling into a place he could call his own. We ended the tour in the kitchen, where a pot of coffee was brewing. As we sat, David said, "I wanted you to be the first to see it after we moved in. I thought you might like to know that. I get it now." I raised an eyebrow, unsure what he meant, and he added, "What it's like to have a place that's yours, not just to live in, but to protect. I think I took that for granted before." His words landed heavier than he probably realized. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was the closest he'd come to articulating the shift in his perspective. I told him I appreciated the invitation, and I meant it. Sitting there, watching the afternoon light filter through the kitchen window, I realized that this was the first time in years I'd been in his home without feeling like an outsider. The unspoken rules that used to hover in the air between us weren't there anymore. It felt less like we were reclaiming the past, and more like we were finally learning how to stand in the present together. As the weeks passed, our contact remained steady but unpressured. He called when he had something to say, and I did the same. There were no more check-in calls born out of guilt or duty. Sometimes we didn't talk for a week, and that was fine. The stability of knowing we could speak when we wanted, and not because we had to, was its own kind of closeness. In late October, he invited me to a small gathering at his house. Just a few neighbors and friends, nothing elaborate. I was hesitant at first, unsure if being in the middle of his social circle might stir old tensions, but the evening was surprisingly easy. I chatted with his neighbors, accepted a slice of pie from his wife, and even ended up in the backyard tossing a football with his kids under the dim light of a porch lamp. It was unremarkable in all the right ways, the kind of night that didn't need to prove anything. When I left that night, David walked me to the door. "Thanks for coming, Dad," he said simply, his voice free of the strained politeness that used to lace those words. I told him I'd enjoyed myself, and as I stepped onto the porch, I realized that what we had now was better than what I'd been trying to hold on to before. It was lighter, freer, built on mutual choice rather than old obligations. Back at my apartment, I sat at the table beneath the two framed pieces on the wall, the Victorian photograph and the green-shuttered house sketch. I thought about how both represented parts of me that had once felt at odds, the past I had let go of and the future I had quietly chosen. And now, for the first time, it felt like there was space in my life for both and for David, without one consuming the other. As November rolled around, I became more aware of the calendar than I had been all year. It was coming up on the 1-year mark since I'd walked out of the Victorian for the last time. The memory of that day still lived in sharp detail. The way the late autumn light had spilled across the floor, the weight of the suitcases on the porch steps, the hollow echo of my footsteps as I locked the door. I wondered how it would feel now, a year later, to look back, not with regret. I'd long since accepted that I'd made the right choice, but with the kind of perspective that only time can give. Thanksgiving week arrived, with its usual mix of chill air and the smell of wood smoke drifting through Salem's streets. The bakery downstairs was busier than ever, their shelves stacked with pumpkin loaves and pies, and it struck me how different this year felt compared to the last. There was no tension in my chest, no waiting for a call that might come with conditions attached. David called 2 days before the holiday, inviting me to their place. "No pressure," he said, "but we'd really like you there." I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't want to go, but because I realized I could say yes or no entirely on my own terms. I ended up agreeing, and on Thanksgiving morning, I took the train into Boston carrying a bottle of wine and a loaf of cranberry bread from the bakery. The atmosphere in their home was warm and unpretentious. Kids playing in the living room, the smell of roasting turkey in the kitchen. There was no sense of me being slotted into a corner, no unspoken message that I was there out of obligation. I moved between rooms easily, chatting with guests, refilling drinks, and for the first time in years, feeling like part of the current instead of an anchor someone had to drag along. At one point, David pulled me aside onto the back porch. "I've been meaning to say this," he began, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I know it took me too long to understand, but I get why you did what you did. And I'm glad you did it." He met my eyes then, and there was no defensiveness, no trace of the man who'd once spoken to me like a problem to be managed. "It changed things," he continued, "for both of us, in a good way." I told him I agreed, and for the first time, I felt those words land without a shadow trailing behind them. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of conversation and clinking cutlery. As the sun dipped low and the sky turned that deep indigo that only late November can hold, I found myself in the living room with his kids, building a makeshift fort out of blankets and couch cushions. Their laughter filled the space in a way that was entirely uncalculated, and I realized how much of my life had been spent trying to preserve moments like that, as if they could be bottled and kept forever. Now I understood that they only mattered because they couldn't be. When I left that evening, David walked me to the train station. We stood there for a moment, neither of us, in a rush to end the day. "Same time next year?" he asked, half smiling. I returned the smile and said, "We'll see, but probably." It wasn't a promise, and that was what made it real. No guarantees, no illusions, just the quiet agreement to keep choosing this when it felt right. Back in my apartment, I poured a glass of wine and sat at the table, the photograph of the Victorian and the sketch of the green-shuttered house looking down on me. The distance between those two images felt smaller. Now, not because the past had returned, but because I'd finally built something in the present that could stand alongside it. The boundaries I'd drawn a year ago were still there, but they no longer felt like walls. They were just the shape of the life I wanted to live. That night before I turned in, I wrote a short note and tucked it into the drawer beneath the photograph. It said simply, "1 year later, and I have no doubts." I didn't write it for David, or for Eleanor, or even for the sake of remembering later. I wrote it for myself, The man who'd once stood on a porch with a suitcase in hand, stepping into the unknown, trusting that there was something worth finding on the other side. Winter settled over Salem with the kind of quiet that felt almost ceremonial. The streets emptied earlier in the evenings, the light from shop windows spilling onto the sidewalks like little pockets of warmth. From my kitchen window, I could see the park covered in a thin sheet of frost, the benches glistening under the street lamps. My life had taken on a steady rhythm. Coffee at sunrise, walks when the cold wasn't too biting, afternoons with my sketchbook or a good book. There was nothing dramatic in it, nothing that would catch someone else's attention, but it felt like mine in a way life hadn't for years. That was enough. One snowy afternoon, I wandered into Paul's antique shop to escape the wind. He had a new display near the window, old architectural blueprints, neatly rolled and tied, with faded ribbon. As I sifted through them, one caught my eye, a 19th century floor plan for a modest seaside home, its lines clean and deliberate. It reminded me of my own early designs, the kind I drew before clients started insisting on bigger and flashier. I bought it without hesitation, knowing exactly where it would go in my apartment. Back home, I hung it beside the Victorian photograph and the green-shuttered house sketch. 3 pieces, 3 stages of my life, side by side. David called more frequently that winter, though our conversations were short and easy. Sometimes he'd tell me about repairs he was making to his new place. Other times, he'd share small updates about the kids. It struck me how different these calls felt from the ones we'd had in the past. There was no undercurrent of managing or persuading, no attempt to steer me toward his idea of what my life should look like. He asked questions and listened to the answers, which, in its own quiet way, was something of a miracle. In early February, he came to Salem with the kids for the day. We walked through the historic district, stopping at the bakery for pastries and hot chocolate. The children darted ahead, pointing at the old houses and asking questions I was happy to answer. "That one's called a mansard roof," I explained at one point, and David gave me a look, not impatient, not distracted, but genuinely interested. It was a small thing, but it stayed with me. For years, I'd felt like my knowledge, my history, had no place in his world. Now, here he was, making space for it. When they left that evening, the apartment felt warmer than usual, even as the cold seeped in from the windows. I sat at the table with the 3 frame pieces on the wall and realized how much they mirrored the arc of the last year. The Victorian was the life I'd built and released. The green-shuttered house was the choice I made to start again. And the blueprint, that was the reminder that creation is ongoing, that there is always another design to draw, another structure to shape. By March, the days grew a little longer, the snow melting into slush along the curbs. I found myself walking to the harbor more often, sketchbook in hand, watching the water shift from steel gray to the deep blue that meant spring was near. One afternoon, as I was finishing a drawing, I thought about how far I'd come since the day David called to tell me there was no room for me in his life. I no longer carried that sentence like a stone in my pocket. It had lost its weight, its sting. In its place was something quieter. Not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance. The 1-year anniversary of the apartment came in April. I marked it the way I'd marked so many milestones this past year, quietly. I bought myself a bottle of good wine, roasted a simple dinner, and left the phone on the counter without checking it. There was no need for fanfare, no audience required. The celebration was in the living itself, in knowing that I had built a life here, one choice at a time, and that it was strong enough to hold me. That night, before bed, I took the small note I'd written months earlier, 1 year later, and I have no doubts, and tucked it into the back of the frame, holding the Victorian photograph. It belonged there, hidden but present, just like the decisions that had brought me to this place. I didn't need to see it every day. I just needed to know it was there, a quiet truth sealed into the story of the life I had chosen. In late April, David invited me to his home for a small dinner with just the family. It wasn't tied to a holiday or any particular occasion, just a meal. I hesitated at first, out of habit more than anything else, but I said yes. When I arrived, the house felt lived in, comfortable in a way it hadn't during my first visit. The kids ran to greet me, their hands sticky from whatever snack they'd been eating, and David took my coat without the formality that used to mark our interactions. Dinner was simple: roast chicken, vegetables, fresh bread. We sat around the table talking about nothing in particular, the conversation flowing without the careful pauses that used to keep us from touching the old wounds. At one point, his wife asked if I missed the Victorian. I set down my fork and thought about it before answering. I miss the memories, I said, but not the house. Houses, they hold you in place. Sometimes that's good, sometimes it's not. David was quiet. After that, but I saw him nod slightly, as if tucking the thought away. It was a small moment, but it felt like another step in the ongoing shift between us, a recognition that the past can be honored without being carried. As the evening wound down, David walked me to my car. The air was cool, the first hint of spring rain in the breeze. "I'm glad you came," he said simply. And for once, I didn't feel the need to read between the lines. I told him I was glad too, and I meant it. There was no pretense, no performance, just the understanding that we were both choosing to be here in each other's lives in a way that was lighter and more honest than before. The next morning, I woke early and opened the window to let in the soft sounds of the street below. I made coffee, sat at the table, and looked at the wall where the 3 frames hung. The Victorian photograph, the green-shuttered house sketch, and the antique blueprint seemed to tell the whole story without a single word. They were my past, my choice, and my ongoing future, each one separate, but all connected by the hands that had drawn, built, and let go when the time came. In May, I accepted Carol's invitation to join the library's next art exhibit, this time with twice as many sketches. Some were of houses I'd seen on my walks, others purely from imagination. The opening night was busier than the last, and I noticed something new. I no longer felt like I was stepping into a new life. I was simply living it. David showed up midway through the evening, his kids in tow, and they moved from drawing to drawing, asking questions and pointing out their favorites. Seeing them there, in my space, felt like a kind of quiet, full circle. Later that week, I took a walk to the harbor. The water was calm, reflecting the pale blue of the sky, and the breeze carried the faint scent of salt and blooming lilacs from somewhere nearby. I sat on a bench, sketchbook on my lap, and started drawing a house that didn't exist anywhere but in my mind, part Victorian, part Cape Cod, part something entirely new. As the lines took shape, I realized it wasn't meant to represent the past or the present. It was simply what I wanted now, a place that felt open, balanced, and mine. When I got home, I pinned that new sketch on the wall next to the others. 4 frames now, the past, the choice, the reminder, and the possibility. Standing there, I felt the kind of satisfaction that doesn't need to be announced. No one else had. To understand the meaning in that arrangement, it was enough that I did. That night, as I turned off the lights and the apartment settled into its familiar quiet, I thought about the man I'd been a year and a half ago, the one standing on the Victorian porch with a suitcase in hand, unsure of what came next. If I could speak to him now, I'd tell him this: you'll be fine, better than fine. You'll find space you didn't know you had, in your home, in your days, in yourself. And then I'd tell him to walk away without looking back. Sometimes the hardest step isn't walking away, it's deciding to keep walking once you have. A year and a half ago, I didn't know where that road would take me. Now, I see that every choice, even the painful ones, carved out space for something better to grow. Not perfect, not without its quiet aches, but better. And maybe that's all we can really ask for. If you've ever had to let go of a place, a person, or a chapter of your life to protect who you are, you. No, it's not simple. It's not about proving a point. It's about surviving with your dignity intact. I wonder how many of us are holding on to things that feel like safety, when really they're just keeping us from breathing. Tell me if you've been there. Tell me if you've felt that mix of fear and relief, of grief and freedom. And if you know someone who's standing on their own porch right now, suitcase in hand, wondering if they should take that step, share this with them. Maybe it's the nudge they need to trust themselves. And if you want to keep walking alongside stories like this, where the endings are shaped by choice and quiet courage, stay close. There's more to tell, always.